Hello everyone, I am back and I am ready. So I thought an easy brand to research would be Wet n Wild. I mean, a drugstore brand that sells affordable, some may say cheap, lipstick. How complicated could it be? Just wait. So the formal Wet n Wild story, because I always like to refer back to the website, is that they were founded in New York in 1979 and they sold nail polish and lipstick for $1. That's really basically it. The website About Us has 25 facts about Wet n Wild, which are not even always facts, and a lot of it's very repetitive. And there really wasn't a whole lot about their backstory, their origins. That was my first sort of researching red flag, if you will, because normally brands have something about their owners, their first line of products, what their original products looked like. Normally you see the packaging on their website, like it's something that they're proud of. So the fact that this wasn't on the website sounded some alarms for me. And there was just something about that that made me realize it wasn't going to be as easy as I thought it was going to be. But a few Google searches later, and I found that the founder of Wet n Wild was a man named Stanley Acker. I'm going to focus a little bit on Stanley, or Stan as he was also known. He was born in New York in February 1930. One of his first jobs was working in sales, and he worked for a company known as Progressive Drug Company. So they were a manufacturer of like bath and body products. And then he worked at Ketchum & Co., which was a wholesale retailer of similar products. So he was already sort of familiar with sort of the beauty space a little bit. And then he took a large leap from sales and went to become an executive with Hazel Bishop. So Hazel Bishop, the company, changed names and hands many times, but essentially Hazel Bishop was a real person, a true cosmetic pioneer. She had a chemistry degree and worked within the cosmetic industry, eventually developing her own long-lasting lipstick, one of, if not the very first of its kind, and it was launched in 1949. Now, this was much to the dismay of competitors like Revlon. I will eventually get to Revlon's history, but Revlon is one of those giants, sort of like L'Oreal and CoverGirl and Maybelline, that have such long histories that it's going to be like a multi-part series to get into. And Hazel Bishop really deserves her own separate video. Hazel's story is sad in and of itself. She had filed a lawsuit with the company, like her own brand, in 1951 and eventually lost the rights to her own name by 1954. And this is probably around the time that Stanley was working for Hazel Bishop. I couldn't find an exact timeline for when Stan worked for Hazel Bishop, but I figure it was around this time. Hazel Bishop was an affordable cosmetic line, and Stan would have been around to see the development of a lot of affordable nail polish formulas as well as lipsticks. And by 1958, he decided it was time to start his own company. He got together with a couple of friends, Leonard Bindler and Neil Henschel, in 1958, and they formed a company known as Tierra Cosmetics Inc., and they sold as the brand Cosmetically Yours, eventually rebranding entirely to Cosmetically Yours Inc. Cosmetically Yours first focused on eye cosmetics like eyeshadow, mascara, eyeliner, but they quickly developed a fairly full line of fun, colorful, inexpensive makeup. Hazel Bishop was then a competitor of Cosmetically Yours, as was another brand called Artmatic. So there were a number of brands that sold around this price point at drugstores. By the late 1960s, Cosmetically Yours had a bright, colorful image and products that matched, and they were selling fairly well, especially for a lower priced brand. However, they started having financial issues, and by 1969, they had filed multiple times for stock offerings, needing more capital. And then once we get into the 70s, sales really decreased a lot for Cosmetically Yours, and Neil and Leonard decided to move the company to Florida. So there was actually 3 divisions of Cosmetically Yours that I found, but Leonard and Neil created the Florida division of Cosmetically Yours in 1975, while Stan stayed in New York. Leonard and Neil, for the most part, stayed out of cosmetics entirely. There were a few failed investment companies. They were involved with mortgages and just different sort of equity firms. I found a number of names that were tied to both of them, a number of companies that kind of existed for a year or two before they folded, but they really seemed to stay out of the cosmetic industry and just lived very comfortable lives in Florida. And Stan, in 1976, started 7-Eleven Sales, Inc. Now, this is the company that first initially trademarked Wet n Wild, so sounds fine, right? Well, Cosmetically Yours actually owned the Wet n Wild trademark. They filed it legally in 1967, and they had been selling products with the Wet n Wild branding since 1966. 7-Eleven Sales filed a petition to have the Cosmetically Yours trademark canceled. So this is so that there wouldn't be like a trail, because the trademark would be canceled, so it would show sort of the first applicant as being 7-Eleven instead of Cosmetically Yours. Now, of course, they would try and contact Cosmetically Yours first, because a trademark has to be used in order to stay valid, so the fact that it hadn't been used for a while was grounds for the cancellation petition. However, it didn't go to the Florida division, it went to New York, where Stan was. So it got ignored, and the cancellation went through. I found a mention in a newspaper for $1 Wet n Wild lipsticks from 1976, which seems to be the earliest reference post-Cosmetically Yours of something called Wet n Wild, but there's no branding or any pictures, so it could be a coincidence and it could be unrelated, but it's quite possible that these were like the first Wet n Wild lipsticks. Note the ampersand instead of the N. The same styling for Wet n Wild can be seen in this Walgreens 1981 coupon as well for comparison. So 7-Eleven Sales filed for the Wet n Wild trademark in 1979 with a first use date listed as March 3rd, 1978. And this is the Wet n Wild, not Wet and Wild. So it's just a slight little difference there. If anyone can find anything from 1978 or 79 that actually shows Wet n Wild lipsticks, please let me know where and how, because I combed literally thousands of records, thousands, trying to find like a single image of Wet n Wild, and even a mention. So like I mentioned that the coupon from 1976, which was the only thing I could find like post Cosmetically Yours and before the 80s that referenced Wet n Wild in terms of cosmetics. I really double or triple check everything I find out to the best of my ability, but I am just one person. I just really enjoy research, and these videos are a compilation of my findings and my interpretation of my findings. So please feel free to fact check anything sounds weird to you. I'm an individual. I do this on my own because I truly love doing it, and it's just like a great hobby. I really like to do the research part. So if anybody has more connections or other resources, please check, and please, if you feel like it, share it with me, because I like finding new avenues to explore for research as well. But I just wanted to put that little disclaimer in there, is that I'm not claiming to have access to like every single document that ever existed, because that would be impossible. I'm just using the tools that are at my disposal. And I'm also in no way, shape, or form claiming to be an expert in my findings. I'm merely sharing them. But back to Cosmetically Yours for a minute. There really is something that's just not quite right. Like, something is just making me a little suspicious. So like I mentioned previously, there was 3 divisions of Cosmetically Yours. There was a California division, a Florida division, and a New York division. So the California branch was forfeited for not paying taxes and fees in 1970. They are listed as FTB forfeited, meaning that the business entity was forfeited by the Franchise Tax Board for failure to meet tax requirements such as failure to file a return, pay taxes, penalty, etc. The Florida branch of Cosmetically Yours was canceled in 1977 for similar reasons. And the same happened for the New York branch as well. Now, because of when this happened and how records are stored, not everything is digitized. In fact, I found notes in many partial records that said records have been destroyed in the 80s or 90s, which doesn't usually happen. But anyway, my point is there are a lot of oddities here. Also, what stood out to me about the New York Cosmetically Yours is that it's technically the parent company because it came first, but there was an incorporation date of 1984. So it was registered again in 1984 for some reason, when by all accounts, Cosmetically Yours wasn't doing business. No products were being sold under the Cosmetically Yours name. But anyway, that suspicion aside, 7-Eleven sales existed for a couple of years, and then they dissolved and Pavillon Limited was formed in 1984. This is according to the Delaware Business Registry search, and also when the Better Business Bureau opened a file for Pavillon. And Pavillon was inspired by the phonetic sound of a French phrase that translates to beautiful things for beautiful women. And Pavillon also trademarked some of the former Cosmetically Yours products, including the actual phrase cosmetically yours. So allegedly, the story goes that Stan was running this cosmetic company out of his home until it grew too large and he had to relocate. So he purchased a factory in another part of New York and he was manufacturing the products there. Now, I find the timing of when Pavillon was registered to be interesting because in 1984, Inc. magazine called out Pavillon for being one of the fastest growing brands in America. It came in 13th overall, and it's also reportedly the year of Wet n Wild's very first commercial and advertising. But all I could find were theme park commercials because around the same time was the big Wet n Wild theme parks. So that definitely cluttered a lot of the searching for me. I know I haven't mentioned much about the products themselves, but truthfully, it was a lot of lipstick known as Super Moist or Moisture Rich, and nail polish or nail enamel hardener in a rainbow of colors. There really wasn't a lot happening in terms of standout revolutionary product, although they had other items in the line like eyeliners, mascara, lip gloss, and press-on nails. Wet n Wild saved money by doing very little to no advertising, so a lot of the images that I could find were from newspapers advertising deals or specials, and they aren't promo pictures from the brand because those never existed. And even the price point wasn't so unusual for drugstore makeup, but Wet n Wild was definitely what people considered to be budget. 1 year after legally forming Pavillon, Stan sold the brand to an investment group known as Sangers PLC, and this was an investment group based out of the UK. This investment group, which had founded in 1928, quickly rebranded to Pavillon International. In 1986, the international company noted a drop in profits from £1.72 million down to $261,000. In 1988, 3 years after the initial purchase, Pavillon announced it made a loss of £5.4 million. To adjust for inflation, that would be 14.6 million today, or almost 20 million US dollars. After 60 years, the whole company, Pavillon International, folded. Pavillon Limited, based out of the US, was still producing and manufacturing products. And then, in 1989, Ivana Trump sued them. Stan and Pavillon attempted to trademark Ivana for use in cosmetics, and Donald Trump's then wife didn't take too kindly to that, and she filed a $10 million lawsuit. The courts found in favor of Ivana, saying that Pavillon couldn't use her name, and Pavillon dropped the trademark. Ivana, in turn, dropped the lawsuit. Pavillon International went into receivership, and Stan launched a new brand under the Pavillon umbrella Black Radiance in 1991. A team of all white men launched this brand aimed specifically at Black women. Black Radiance at launch included 68 SKUs suitable for 33 different skin tones. Stan claimed that a sophisticated ad campaign and the fact it was created exclusively for Black women was the key elements to its initial success, which was reflected not only in sales figures but in a very positive response, allegedly from women who seemed to, and I'm quoting Stan, prefer Black to the popular cop-out women of color. The most important factor for creating this brand was data at the time suggesting that 54% of 16 million Black women work outside the home, and that these consumers spend 2% of their income on personal products compared to 0.8% for non-Black women. And this man in the picture, so we have Stan and his son Mark and Stephen Manetti. Stephen was recruited shortly after the debut and success of Black Radiance to create Black Opal. Anyway, in 1992, speaking to the Wall Street Journal, Stan, president and chief executive officer of Pavillon, said a management-led group purchased all of the cosmetic company's shares outstanding from Pavillon International, but terms weren't disclosed. In 1993, the Journal News reported that Pavillon successfully repurchased themselves from Pavillon International. This was done by a group that included members of Pavillon, led by Stan, his kids, and M&T Bank. Stan did a number of ads for them, his image and Wet n Wild lipstick tubes all around them. Shortly afterwards, he was appointed to the bank's board of directors. Also in 1993, a new sister brand for Wet n Wild and Black Radiance. This was a line of nail polish, lipsticks, and liner pencils called Sola Para Ti, which means only for you in Spanish. Quoting Stan here, this is a quote from WWD, "Everyone out there is either targeting Black women or sort of reaching for Hispanic women by using the term ethnic or women of color. Our research indicates that the Hispanic population is one of the fastest growing segments. Why doesn't someone cater to them?" The line was pushed to mass market outlets in regions with heavy Hispanic populations, such as Miami, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Phoenix, Arizona. Stan projected that Sola Para Ti would have a wholesale volume of 2.5 million in 1993 alone, because he found that Hispanic women gravitated to vibrant colors, so they created 20 lipsticks and 21 nail polishes that were all in vivid shades, including tangerine, coral, bright copper, and intense red. But Stan really had to work hard to rebuild his brand, specifically Wet n Wild, and he really did. And in 1995, that was a year of non-stop releases. From my research, it seemed like they were releasing a new product every month in 1995. They had 6 new summer shades that were earth tones with shade names like Naked Sands and Mudslide, with an in-store display that headlined "Go with Your Natural Instinct" that featured a woman with windblown hair. See, criticism they had received as a beauty budget brand was that they didn't actually have enough natural options. They had a lot of the fun, colorful stuff, but they didn't have a lot of natural tones, so this was sort of a response to that. But then they also did crazy for color summer shades of nail polish, which had names like Eggplant Frost, Canary, and Denim Chrome. And the heading on the Wet n Wild nail polish display read, "Worn to be wild. Do your own thing." Pavillon also extended more lipstick offerings with Matte and That's That in 6 shades. They had new lip liners and new liquid lip colors as well, with all products costing 99 cents, with the exception of the matte lipstick, which retailed at the time for $1.99. They also launched a lipstick and nail polish called Blackest Red, which was a dupe of Chanel's Vamp. Now, this is a product that deserves its very own video because it was truly a revolutionary product. But Wet n Wild's dupe alone sold over 1 million units in less than 3 months. And also, allegedly, Wet n Wild takes credit for introducing black lipstick to drugstores, and this is believable. However, it's more than likely it was part of the Fantasy Makers collection, which is what they bring out every year at Halloween time. In 1996, Pavillon continued with designer lipstick dupes. They really made dupes of every single popular product that existed. And Wet n Wild at the time was estimated to have brought in 65 to 70 million in global sales, according to Stan, as he was speaking to WWD. He also said, quote, "We're coming up with more promotional ideas." And he cited an example of a new range of blue shades of Wet n Wild lipstick and nail polish. He said, "We may have been getting a little too traditional. You have to keep moving. People need to have a reason to look at your rack." So I thought this was interesting that he mentioned blue, because I found another article from 1992. This was in the Journal News, and Stan actually credited blue nail polish with the initial success of Wet n Wild, saying that he stuck a bottle of blue nail polish right in the middle of the Wet n Wild display rack in the drugstore. And he said, "Everybody said I was crazy. They said nobody would buy blue nail polish. I didn't care. I just wanted to get their attention." Pavillon was really in tune to the price point, and they realized that these were sort of spontaneous purchases. These were purchases that namely women would make when they were doing their shopping or they were at the drugstore, and they would pick it up and they could throw it in without really having to think much about it, especially if it only cost $1. And they had so many different fun shades. So if someone was like, "Oh, I just feel like being adventurous. Gee, I think I'll get like this purple nail polish," they could buy it for $1, and it really wasn't a big commitment. Now, adding to lipsticks that Wet n Wild produced, they first introduced the Mega Wear line in 1996, and this went alongside the already existing Mega Color and then their just general 99-cent lipstick line. Plus, people really started to look forward to the Fantasy Makers collection. As I mentioned previously, it seems to have started out as something separate from Wet n Wild and then kind of merged into Wet n Wild, but people really became excited for it because they had a lot of fun product. Now, until later, they used to have everything, like all kinds of costumey type of makeup. They had a lot of glitter, they would have sequins and like the false eyelashes and like the unique colors of lipsticks that were even unique in terms of what Wet n Wild offered, like the white and black, and just things that weren't normally seen in drugstore lipstick displays. All kinds of strange colors and like body paints and crayons and things like that. So people started to really get excited for this and get really hyped for it, and especially people who had alternative styles were excited for the Fantasy Makers because it was products that then they could incorporate and wear just as they pleased in their daily life. The couple of years of heavily producing and pushing new products really paid off because Pavillon sold to AM Cosmetics in 1997 for $100 million. Quite a leap to go from a company that was losing millions to a company that sold for millions of dollars. AM Cosmetics at this time owned the #1 Wet n Wild competitor, Artmatic. Now, Artmatic was a competitor of Hazel Bishop and Cosmetically Yours, and this was another just affordable drugstore brand. And AM Cosmetics had purchased them at this point, and then they purchased Wet n Wild, and they ended up creating an enormous combined company. Stan stayed on as a chairman of the board for the combined company, but he later dropped down to merely a consultant. His son, Mark, was executive vice president of the company, but only for a couple of months before he unexpectedly resigned. And in 1998, 1 year after the $100 million acquisition of Pavillon, AM Cosmetics was nearly $240 million in debt. They defaulted on a $6 million loan, and the bank stepped in. After restructuring debt, they managed to sell off to Markwins for $32 million. So Pavillon, which included Wet n Wild, Sol Aperitif, and Black Radiance, sold to AM Cosmetics for $100 million, and then Markwins purchased the entirety of AM Cosmetics for $32 million. And not every brand even made the cut. Wet n Wild did, obviously, and they were considered sort of the bread and butter brand. Black Radiance did as well. Sol Aperitif did not. And neither did Wet n Wild's #1 competitor, Artmatic. This deal was finalized in 2003, and Markwins relocated Wet n Wild to Los Angeles, their headquarters, and they moved production to China. This remains Wet n Wild's home today. Markwins still owns them, and Markwins has done a lot to change the appearance of Wet n Wild, and the Wet n Wild we have now looks very, very different to the Wet n Wild that existed before. Markwins definitely stepped up and changed Wet n Wild in so many, in my opinion, positive ways. So with these videos, I'm not really exploring product ranges necessarily. I'm not really looking at current brand histories because I'm more interested in talking about the past and the origin stories. Not saying that I won't discuss these things at a later time, but just this is why I'm calling it an origin story, because it's not talking about like current issues with Wet n Wild. However, there is one thing I do want to talk about before I wrap up, and that's about Wet n Wild's animal testing claims. So many people probably already know about the issues that came to light in 2019 with Wet n Wild's animal testing claims. Essentially, what I understand about it is that Wet n Wild products were found being sold in mainland China. People were taking photos of actual displays of the makeup and being sold in mainland China, regardless of whatever the explanation was. It means that they are subject to animal testing, meaning that Wet n Wild is not considered entirely cruelty-free. And I know a lot of cruelty-free websites and like sites that have compilations and lists of cruelty-free brands have removed Wet n Wild from those lists. So Wet n Wild has denied this. They still say that they are entirely cruelty-free. And what I found very interesting is that they're very insistent that they are cruelty-free. They have always been cruelty-free. They have never ever tested on animals, and they never ever will. Like, that's a lot of the language that they use, and it's everywhere. Anywhere you go to look for Wet n Wild products, it's like listed cruelty-free, cruelty-free. We've never tested on animals. Well, I found an article that says otherwise, Wet n Wild. So, according to an article I found from the Journal News based out of New York in 1997, Wet n Wild in fact tested on animals until 1991. So this newspaper at this time had a very interesting, almost like expose about animal cruelty and animal testing. And there was one particular article that had a headline of "Cosmetics Makers Find Alternatives." So this is from January of 1997. It mentions how Wet n Wild tested on animals, and I quote, "Until about 1991, the Nyack-based maker of Wet n Wild Cosmetics tested its products on rabbits, but a few employees always cringed, including Bob Dunn." Now, Bob Dunn was, at the time of the article, the director of research and development for Papillon. He said, quote, "I never did believe in it. They would put mascara, eyeshadow, humongous amounts of stuff on the lid of the rabbit's eye to try to see the sensitization." And Bob credited the public, mostly teenagers, for calling the company, pressuring them to change. Now, the reason I bring this up is because companies lie about their image all of the time. And I think this is just another example of that. So I think it's really important to challenge any claim a company makes, because they are always trying to make themselves look better. I just think it's important to acknowledge that these are brands that are trying to create images for themselves. They are trying to make themselves look appealing. They are trying to make money and sell products, and they are going to say whatever they feel like they need to say in order to accomplish that. But I just wanted to share this because as soon as I read this article, I was like, oh, really? Because like the first fact on their About Us is that, you know, we've been cruelty-free forever, which is not true. And it just seems like such a silly thing to lie about, but that's what brands do. So anyway, I hope you found this interesting. Let me know if you have any questions, comments, or concerns. Let me know what other brands you would be interested in hearing an origin story about. I do plan to get to all of them eventually. I really love these history videos. And if you have any other video ideas, any other sort of aspects of like the beauty industry or products you'd like me to look into or whatever, I'm always open to suggestions. Everything is welcome. Please lay it on me, and any feedback you can give me in terms of like the video structure is appreciated, as well as this is a new concept for me and I really want to make sure that I'm providing enough information that people would be interested in. So if there's an angle I didn't talk about that you would like to see me cover in a future video, please let me know as well. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day or night wherever you are, and I hope we get a chance to chat soon. Bye for now.